Near midnight, on Route 9, the air seemed to freeze. The forest on either side of the road stretched out endlessly. The flickering neon light of the old gas station sat silently in the wilderness. The open 24/7 sign blinked like a rotten tooth trying to fix the past. Ezra Cole pedaled through the harsh wind, his shoulders wrapped in a woolen scarf, hands gloved in black velvet. Sweat began to bead under his earth-colored jacket. He stopped his bike in front of the shop. The scratched glass door let out a heavy squeal as Ezra pushed it open. Inside, the fluorescent lights smeared hazily, yellow with dust, flickering like tired eyes. The refrigerator buzzed with a low, grinding hum, like the breath of an old, tired animal. Ezra walked over to the toy section, searching for a birthday gift for his sister. She liked the little pink teddy bears. He sifted through a pile of dusty pillows, finding one small enough, still with its price tag. But the longer Ezra stood there, the more the atmosphere felt strange. He felt someone's gaze on him from behind the counter. It wasn't like being watched, but more like being scrutinized, judged. That gaze asked a question before the answer came. Ezra quickly turned around. Behind the counter, an old man stared at him. He wore a light blue gas station uniform. Tall and solid, his hand rested on the wooden counter like an ancient tree whose roots had taken hold. "Are you looking for something?" the old man asked, his voice dry as dead leaves. Ezra jumped, putting the teddy bear back on the counter. I'm just looking for a small gift for my sister." The man didn't respond, only stared Ezra up and down. From his jacket to his jeans to his dusty Converse shoes. Nearby, the small backpack on his back looked like a prison. "That big backpack, easy-to-pack stuff, huh?" he muttered more than asked. Ezra didn't answer. He stood up straight, feeling like he was being tested by someone's eyes. This wasn't a conversation. This was an inspection. "Hey," the old man's voice turned colder. "Why don't you put that backpack on the counter for me?" Ezra looked at him. "I only have books, nothing to—" "Just put it on the counter, I'll check it quickly." The words seemed to pass through an air funnel, dry, sharp, and laden with emphasis. Ezra didn't want to cause trouble, but his heart began to race. Why had everything suddenly become so suspicious? He unstrapped his backpack and placed it on the counter. The old man unlocked it, rummaging through the inside. The backpack sat empty before the bookshelf. One detective novel. 2 notebooks. A small key. "Is that all?" The man looked at Ezra, his voice unwavering. Ezra nodded, no longer feeling the need to explain. The man handed the backpack back with a dismissive gesture, clearly letting Ezra know who was in charge. The door swung open. The tinkling of the bell echoed. A middle-aged man stepped in, wearing a security jacket, his silver badge gleaming on the left chest. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking at Ezra first, then at the old man. The air in the shop seemed to tighten into a thin, invisible fog. Ezra swallowed hard. And suddenly he knew tonight wasn't just about buying a gift. Ezra said nothing more. But his eyes began scanning the store. This wasn't the first time he'd been suspected. It was the first time he felt the suffocating pressure of this place. He remembered a few months ago when he stood here with his father. His father had just received a call about a missing child from the neighboring town. It was the same neon light. The same old man behind the counter. But when he was with Samuel, the man's gaze was completely different. Then it was a look of submission. Now it was suspicion. Ezra bit his lip. A faint thought flickered in his mind. Was it possible that the only difference wasn't in his behavior, but in where people thought he stood? The position of a child walking alone. The position of someone with no one to protect him. The security guard placed his hand on his belt, looking at the old man with a gaze that was hard to tell if it was agreement or suspicion. What's the kid doing here at this hour? Ezra opened his mouth to answer, but his words were interrupted by the old man. I saw him rummaging through the shelves for quite a while, clearly trying to take something. The security guard nodded toward Ezra. Really? Is there anything in the backpack? Ezra gritted his teeth. I already put the backpack on the counter for him to check. There's only notebooks and books in there. My sister's birthday is tomorrow. I came to buy her a teddy bear. The old man sniffed. A teddy bear at this hour? You're riding your bike in the middle of the night just to buy a bear? Ezra hesitated. My dad, she only likes that now. And I promised I'd buy it. Tomorrow morning we leave for camp, so I didn't want to miss it. The security guard tilted his head. Let me see the backpack again. Ezra stiffened, but under the pressure of two watchful eyes, he quietly placed the backpack on the counter. The guard put his hand on the flap, opening it and pulling out the contents one by one. A detective novel. 2 old notebooks. A pencil case. Finally, a folded receipt. What's this? The guard unfolded the paper and frowned. A purchase receipt from 3 days ago from this very shop. Ezra grimaced, recalling. It was indeed the receipt from the last time he bought a detective novel here, and he'd stuffed it into the backpack and forgotten. I must have forgotten that old receipt in the bag. I bought the book last time I came. The guard didn't say a word. The old man shook his head as if he had enough reasons. Ezra felt his face burn, not from anger, but from the sting of shame. He stood there, feeling exposed under the tired light of the shop, like a criminal awaiting judgment. And are you sure, the old man continued, that there's nothing else you accidentally slipped into your jacket pocket? Ezra took half a step back, confused. I didn't. Suddenly, the security guard leaned down and picked up a plastic superhero toy from the edge of the counter. This was right by the wall. Did you drop it? No, I didn't take it. I haven't even been to that section. But Ezra's words seemed to dissolve into the thick air. Everything in the shop fell silent, except for the ticking of the old cash register's clock, quietly keeping rhythm, passing judgment. Ezra stood there, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack until his knuckles were white. He wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but all he could do was stand still, swallowing back his tears. A sudden, sharp screech came from outside, the sound of a car pulling to a stop. Ezra swallowed, his mind in turmoil. In his confusion, memories of the moral lessons from class flashed through his head: justice, righteousness, faith in society. But now all of those things seemed fragile, even laughable. No one in this shop believed him. There was no one on his side. And that made him realize a lesson greater than anything he had ever read. Trust is not something that's given. It has to be earned, step by step. Ezra swallowed, his mind in turmoil. In his confusion, memories of the moral lessons from class flashed through his head, justice, righteousness, faith in society. The engine's roar faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. The security guard and the old man both lifted their heads, their eyes fixed on the dusty glass door. The door chimed the familiar sound again. A figure appeared, stepping in with a tall, straight posture, wearing an old leather coat that still held its firm structure. Ezra turned his head. His eyes lit up for a moment. The man was none other than Samuel Cole, his father. He didn't look at anyone immediately, instead walking to the counter, his eyes briefly scanning his son before settling on the old man. His voice was low, calm but resonant. "What's going on here?" No one spoke at first. The old man hesitated before saying, "We're just checking. This kid seems to be acting suspicious." Samuel nodded slightly. "Checking? Got any proof?" The security guard replied, "Nothing specific. But the kid's here in the middle of the night, and it looks like he's hiding something in his backpack." "The same backpack you've searched twice?" Samuel's voice remained steady, but the weight of it began to deepen. "And what did you find?" "Just an old receipt and a couple of notebooks." Samuel crossed his arms. "So, is this a checkup or a judgment?" The air in the shop thickened. The old man pursed his lips while the security guard looked down at the floor, trying to avoid meeting the man's gaze. Samuel stepped forward, slowly but with purpose. "Samuel Cole. If you've been here long enough, you probably know I was the sheriff in this area. And I'm no stranger to this kind of check-in." The old man swallowed. "We meant no harm, just being cautious." "Caution is good," Samuel replied. "But when caution turns into baseless suspicion, it's no longer protection, it's prejudice." The security guard sighed quietly. I didn't know you were his father." "If I had known." "Then it would have been different," Samuel interrupted, his tone deepening. "The issue isn't who my son is. The issue is you need to learn how to see people as people, not as threats." Samuel turned to the old man, his voice deliberate. 20 years ago, I arrested a man right here in this shop. It was out of suspicion, out of prejudice. But I was wrong. And I've carried that mistake for over 2 decades. This boy is my son. But if he weren't my son, then what? What would you do?" The old man lowered his head. For the first time, his hand trembled as it tapped the counter. Ezra looked back at his father. And in his father's eyes, he saw not just anger, but a pain that had never healed. A long silence hung in the air. The old man no longer looked anyone in the eye, and the security guard turned to Ezra, his gaze now no longer as stiff as it had been before. Samuel moved closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "If I hadn't come in time, how would tonight have ended? A false report? A child accused without evidence?" No one answered. The old man looked down at the counter, his fingers tapping lightly in a rhythm of anxiety. Samuel glared at him, his gaze icy. "Next time, learn to see people in the light, not in the shadows." He turned to Ezra. "Let's go." Father and son walked out of the shop. The night wind blew again, bringing with it the chill, but it also carried away the heavy silence from inside. From a distance, the tail lights of the car faded into the night, leaving behind a still shop where the silence was not peaceful, but a wordless remorse. Samuel turned back toward the old man, his voice slow. 20 years ago, I arrested a man right here in this shop. It was out of suspicion, out of prejudice. But I was wrong. And carried that mistake for over 2 decades. This boy is my son. But if he weren't my son, then what? What would you do? The old man lowered his head. For the first time, his hand trembled as it tapped the counter. Ezra looked back at his father. And in his father's eyes, he saw not just anger, but a pain that had never healed. The car sped through the night, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural silence. Inside the car, Samuel kept a firm grip on the wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Ezra sat beside him, still clutching his backpack on his lap like an invisible shield. "You okay?" Samuel asked, his eyes never leaving the road. Ezra nodded but didn't say a word. The lump in his throat still lingered, not exactly from fear but from an injustice that simmered inside him, something he'd never known before. "You didn't do anything wrong," Samuel added, his voice softer now. "But sometimes people just need a reason, or sometimes no reason at all, to look at you like you're suspicious." The wind outside rushed through the crack in the open window, bringing with it the smell of asphalt and pine sap. Ezra stared out the window, his eyes growing distant. "Dad," he spoke quietly, "if you hadn't come, what would have happened?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He turned the wheel slowly, the car veering onto a side street leading home. "A night like that can change a person's future," he replied. "Just one report. One statement. One wrong memory. That's why justice can't stand on prejudice." Ezra fell silent. For the first time in his life, he clearly felt the line between light and darkness not where he stood, but where others saw him from. He turned to look at his father, the man who had once been a symbol of strength in his eyes as a child, now his true spiritual refuge. Not because he was once the sheriff, but because he knew how to protect, calmly and with understanding. "Dad, did you ever go through something like this?" Ezra asked, his voice barely a whisper. Samuel was silent for a few seconds. "I did," he answered. "When I was your age. In a bookstore where they thought I was stealing just because I wore an old coat. That stayed with me forever. It didn't leave a bruise on my skin, but it left a scratch in my memory." The car pulled up in front of the small house, and Ezra stepped out, pausing for a moment to look up at the night sky. The sky was still dark, but between the patches of black, a small constellation twinkled, weak but unwavering. Inside, the living room lights were still on. His sister Layla was asleep on the couch, a small birthday cake sitting on the table, with a card that read, "Happy Birthday from Brother Ezra." Ezra saw it, and for the first time that night, his lips curled into a tired smile. He took the teddy bear out of his backpack, gently placing it beside the cake, then pulled a thin blanket over his sister. In the soft yellow light, his shadow stretched long across the wall, no longer trembling like it had before. Before leaving the room, Ezra looked back at Layla. He sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of exhaustion. It was the release of something he had carried on his shoulders all night. He didn't say anything more. It wasn't necessary. Some stories you just have to keep inside, like a scratch. Not deep, but enough to remind you that you've walked through a cold night. A night and a lesson. When Ezra closed the door to his sister's room, the faint yellow light was swallowed by the darkness of the hallway. He stood still for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the wall, as if listening to something that had no sound. Then he pulled out his phone, opened the camera app, and looked at the photo of the teddy bear placed beside the birthday cake. Everything seemed to have returned to its rightful place, but inside him, something still felt unresolved. Outside, the wind continued to blow. In the forest behind the house, the trees whispered like muffled secrets. Elsewhere, a few blocks away, at the convenience store by the roadside, the place that had become a dark spot in Ezra's memory, the neon light flickered erratically again. The glass door still had faint handprints on it, and the ceiling camera continued to swivel slowly, as if still watching something. The old man had closed the store earlier than usual. He sat alone in the back office, a cold cup of coffee at his side, the camera monitor flickering with static. The security guard had left. It was just him now. But he couldn't sleep. On the desk was a piece of paper he had pulled from the drawer, a faded old photo. In the photo, a group of 3 teenagers stood in front of this very store more than 20 years ago. One of them looked strikingly like a young Samuel Cole. He stared at the photo. His face grew still, as if pulled back into a memory never spoken of. A small scar behind his ear, one he had always kept hidden, suddenly throbbed, reminding him that even old wounds can resurface in the quiet of sleep. He pulled an old notebook from the drawer, flipping through a few pages until he found a scribbled line. Last time, 2002. Didn't call the police. No one knew. He sighed, his hand trembling as he folded the page and put the notebook back in the drawer. Outside, a figure stood by the curb, not far from the store. His face was hidden under the brim of his hat, but his eyes were clear, not curiosity, but recognition. He stood there for a long time, then turned and walked away, leaving behind a row of streetlights flickering off one by one, as if the wind had stolen their light. The next morning, Ezra woke up early. He stepped outside, the first light of day shining through the light mist like a quiet apology from the night sky. Layla was playing with the teddy bear, giggling softly. Ezra watched her for a moment, then turned to see his father making coffee in the kitchen. "Dad," he began. Samuel turned around, nodding slightly. "I think maybe I should learn more about the things you never told me." He smiled, setting the coffee cup down. "We've got time." Ezra nodded. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing he was sure of. He wouldn't let one cold night define who he was. And somewhere in the town of Route 9, the door to old memories had cracked open once more. But this time, no one would remain silent. A week later, the rain drizzled on. Drops of water trickled down the glass window of Ezra's room, leaving streaks like memories that had yet to fade. Ezra sat on the bed. In front of him was his father's old notebook, something he had just been allowed to read. Inside were many notes about cases Samuel had handled during his time as sheriff. But what made Ezra stop was a page with no date, just a line that read, "Route 9 2002, unforgettable." He looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Dad," Ezra spoke. "What happened in 2002? Samuel stood by the window, silent for a moment before walking over and sitting down across from his son. 3 kids got arrested for petty theft. Among them there was one boy who was just holding on to the stolen item for a friend. Ezra furrowed his brow. "And you were the one who arrested him?" Samuel nodded slowly. At the time, everything was based on instinct and the records. But the truth is, we didn't have any solid evidence. Later on, they found the stolen item, still in the warehouse, untouched, unaccounted for. So what happened to the boy? Samuel clenched his fists. He had to switch schools. His parents got divorced, and he disappeared from the town just a few months later. Ezra exhaled sharply. The old man, was he involved? Samuel was silent, then spoke slowly. He was the one who reported it. And he was the one who insisted on lying about the camera footage? Outside, the thunder rumbled softly. Layla ran in, asking Ezra about the second birthday cake he had promised. He stood up and ruffled her hair. It's coming soon. But this time, I'll make it myself. That afternoon, Ezra rode his bike alone to the convenience store. The door was still open. But the cashier had changed. Now it was a young man who looked slightly surprised when he saw Ezra. "Can I help you?" "No, I just wanted to look around." Ezra walked over to the old counter. Everything had changed, but the smell of rotting wood and fluorescent dust still lingered. He gave a small smile, then pulled a scrap of paper from his backpack, the old photo of Samuel standing in front of the store, beside the old man. Ezra pinned it to the bulletin board at the corner of the counter, beneath the words, "Old Customers." No one asked anything. He walked out, the rain starting to fall lightly. As he pedaled past the stretch of Route 9's forest, it no longer seemed so scary. It was just another road like any other. But what was different now was that he knew he was riding toward the light. A light he had fought to claim for himself. 2 days later, the sun shone gently. Ezra sat in his room, flipping through the pages of his father's old leather notebook. Among the neatly aligned words, a thin folded paper slipped out from the spine of the book. It wasn't an investigation note. It was a handwritten letter. The first line read, "To Nathan, if you still remember your name." Ezra held his breath and began to read. "Nathan, I don't know if you're still in town or if you've gone far away. I also don't know if you still believe in justice or if you just think all adults are wrong. That day, I should have looked at you longer. I should have asked one more question, checked more thoroughly, put my trust where it belonged, or at least waited for that broken camera footage to be restored. But I did nothing. I trusted the accusation, my colleagues, my gut, instead of trusting a child standing there, shivering and unable to speak. And that decision destroyed your family. I heard you transferred schools. Then you disappeared from town. Your parents divorced. Your mom cried a lot. Your dad threw himself into his work as if he could forget. But I haven't forgotten a thing. I'm writing this letter to say, I'm sorry. Even if it's too late. Even if it never reaches you. Route 9, Summer 2002. Signed, Samuel Cole. Ezra folded the letter back up, his hand trembling slightly. He took it downstairs and handed it to his father. Samuel looked at the piece of paper, then sank heavily into the chair as if he had just lost some weight inside himself. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. Ezra sat silently for a moment, then said, "I want to go to Nathan's old address. I want to leave the letter there. Not to make up for the past, but because this needs to be finished." Samuel nodded. He didn't say anything more. He simply placed his hand lightly on his son's shoulder, a gesture both of agreement and of passing on something unfinished. The old house stood deep in an alley, the wooden fence covered in moss. Ezra stood still for a moment before slipping the letter through the gap in the door. Along with it was a small note. "If you're Nathan, this is for you. If not, please don't open it." On the way back, Ezra didn't look back. He knew there were some things that didn't need answers. Just needed to be sent and the heart would feel lighter. That evening he sat and wrote in his notebook, "I can't make up for my father's mistakes, but I can make sure I don't repeat them." Outside the window, the wind blew again across Route 9. But this time Ezra didn't hear the sharp, cold sting. There was only a soft sound, a long overdue whisper of forgiveness returning. 2 days after sending the letter, Ezra received a small package with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on yellowed paper. The first line read, "Some things are not in the records and some people are never named." No signature. No date. But immediately, Ezra recognized the handwriting, exactly like the birthday card his mother had once kept, the card Nathan had given Ezra when they were both in 4th grade. He read on, "I read your father's letter. Not to forgive, but out of curiosity. After that incident, my family fell apart. But not just because of the accusation, but because of something I never said. That night, there was a 4th person in the store. Not an employee, not a customer. A boy in a black hoodie, standing back in the shadows behind the bread rack. He's the one who slipped his hand into my pocket, shoved the item inside, and disappeared. When I was called back to the counter, I didn't have time to speak. Because I was scared. Scared that if I spoke up, I'd be called a liar. I'm not writing this letter to reopen old wounds. I just want to tell Ezra, don't just look at what's in the records. The truth lies in the gaps." Ezra put the letter down, his heart racing. A 4th person? A shadow that had never been mentioned in any report? He immediately went downstairs, handing the letter to his father. Samuel read silently, his eyes gradually darkening like the sky before a storm. "What do you think?" he asked. Ezra replied, "I don't think this is the end. This is the beginning of a new question." Samuel nodded slowly. He went back to his office, opened an old file cabinet, and pulled out a dusty stack of papers, the Route 9 2002 case. They began going over each line, each statement. And for the first time in more than 2 decades, that file was opened again. Outside the window, the rain began to fall. But inside the old room, the yellow light still shone. 2 people, 2 generations, bowed their heads before a truth that had yet to be completed. And somewhere out there, the person not in the records might be waiting to be called by name. Appreciate you staying with us. Not everyone gets to hear the untold. If this intrigued you, drop a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the Untold Story to uncover even more.